So good afternoon, everyone. My name's Karen Thornber. I'm the Harry Tuchman Levin Professor in Literature and Professor of East Asian Languages and Civilizations in the Department of Comparative Literature and the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations here at Thornber. Welcome to today's seminar of the Weatherhead Center's program on U.S.-Japan relations. I'm delighted to introduce to you all today's speaker, Professor Seiji Shirane. Professor Shirane is Assistant Professor in the Department of History and affiliated faculty member of the Asian Studies program at the City College of New York. Professor Shirane is a historian of modern Japan. His research and teaching interests include Japan's empire, colonial Taiwan, and Japanese-Chinese relations. Last year, Professor Shirane published his first book titled Imperial Gateway, Colonial Taiwan and Japan's Expansion in South China and Southeast Asia, 1895 to 1945. This book came out with Cornell University Press. Professor Shirane's book explores the political, social, and economic significance of colonial Taiwan in the southern expansion of Japan's empire from 1895 to the end of World War II. Professor Shirane's book challenges our understandings of empire that tend to focus on bilateral relations between metropole on one hand and colonial periphery on the other. Instead, Professor Shirane's book focuses on the dynamic relations between Japan, China, Taiwan, and Western regional powers. We are so grateful to Seiji, to Professor Shirane, for making a stop at Harvard, among many other campuses on his quite extensive book tour. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, our co-sponsors for today, the Edwin O. Reischauer Institute of Japanese Studies, the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies, as well as the Harvard University Asia Center. And so Professor Shirane will speak for about 30 minutes, and that will be followed by about 25 minutes of questions from the audience. So now I would like to turn the podium over to Professor Shirane.
So thanks to Karen Thornber for the wonderful, kind introduction. Thanks to Shinju and others at Weatherhead for really generously inviting me, the co-sponsors. Many faculty members at Harvard have been supportive, especially Karen, who generously read my dissertation, gave me really supportive but helpful comments of how to revise it. Many things have happened since 2014. A child, a pandemic. So I'm very glad to have gotten this out. But again, thanks for many people in the audience who supported this to make it happen. I'll start just by the book cover. You see a Taiwanese interpreter with a white armband with the characters Tsu for Tsuyaku. He's a Taiwanese military interpreter in Hainan Island, the southernmost island of China in 1940. Translating, interpreting, for the Japanese soldiers and then the Chinese POW with his hands tied behind his back on the left. So, usually when we think about the China war front, the second Sino-Japanese War, we're not thinking about Taiwanese or Taiwan, but not just during the war, but even before the war, Taiwan plays a major role in Japan's informal and then later formal empire in South China. Even though I went into grad school thinking about wanting to do Sino-Japanese relations, something that was different from Manchuria or the China Treaty port cities like Shanghai, and I really thought about South China and Taiwan relations, Southeast Asia became an equally important part of the book, and I'll explain why in a second. So the key word for the title, Imperial Gateway, really looking at Taiwan, its institutions, the Japanese officials, as well as Taiwanese subjects, all with their own interests and ambitions. We obviously know that there are many rivalries within Japan, the foreign ministry, navy, army, etc. But we have to take the colonial government generals, such as the Taiwan government general, seriously, as we do with the Korean government general and other bureaucracies. So what is it, how does empire work on the ground in relation with the metropole, with Japanese and Taiwanese with their own imperial interests and ambitions? We think of Taiwan as naturally part of East Asia today, But if you look, especially with Taiwan under Qing rule for 2 centuries, with Western Taiwan, with this Japanese postcard 1902, with ethnic Han race or Han peoples. But when you look at the anthropological studies that the Japanese do for the indigenous Taiwanese, derogatorily called obviously Seiban or savages, and even today the Austronesian ethno-linguistic ties make Taiwan just as much a part of the South Pacific and Southeast Asia as they do part of East Asia. And the Japanese are the ones trying to tap into the Chinese and Austronesian possibilities for further expansion. Taiwan's history is extremely rich, can't really go into all of the periods we're focusing on Japanese rule, but what came before and then after matters a lot in terms of how we approach this history. Unlike Korean studies, which is an established institutional and academic presence, not only in Korea, but throughout the world, obviously there are very few Taiwanese study centers, and much of that has to do with Taiwan being part of the ROC. And until the 1990s, you couldn't talk about a Taiwan-centered or Taiwanese perspective. It was all under the anti-Japanese ROC, Chinese nationalist paradigm. This book could not have been written without Academia Sinica's Institute of Taiwan History. They transcribed oral histories and memoirs of servicemen who have since passed. I draw on that for the second half of my book, as well as the extensive archiving and digitization of Japanese and Taiwanese sources. Again, when we compare it to the accessibility of sources in mainland China, I mean, it's a paradise. I'm first and foremost a Japan specialist, and when we think about different generations of scholars, we have the seminal Deuce, PD, Myers books in the 80s that many of us probably still use for teaching. But even beyond those edited volumes, generally speaking, when people focus on Taiwan or Korea or Manchuria, as Karen kindly introduced, much of it is on these bilateral relations. What is Japan's impact on Taiwan and vice versa? And the second generation of total empire, Louis Young, we understand that Taiwan's not out there or Koreans out there. It has a huge impact on Japanese identity and social political formation. Yet again, it's really a two-way relations, with the exception of those such as contact nebulae, et cetera, that are, for the last 10, 20 years, looking at the multi directions. Then in terms of Sino-Japanese relations, a lot of it is on the informal empire treaty port cities, especially Shanghai, Manchuria Railway. And then we have the wartime empire with the Sino-Japanese War, and then Kominka in Korea and Taiwan. I think these three sort of directions have to be studied together, and you can't cover everything, but my sort of methodological approach is to say you can't look at Taiwan without looking at China, without looking at both the pre-war and wartime period to look at the continuing changes, as well as you have East Asianists. I'm not a Southeast Asianist, but again, these are interrelated, not just 1940s, but even before that. So again, this is not unusual in terms of a regional framework to approach Taiwan. But I do think it allows us to look at Taiwan's role beyond Japan, Taiwan, much like Korea and Manchuria in terms of Mansen, and then people such as, Sakura Christmas looking at Mammo with Manchuria, Mongolia, et cetera. These regional frameworks at the peripheries are extremely interesting. Again, when we're teaching our modern Japan or World War II class, we inevitably talk about Army, Navy, Foreign Ministry rivalries, but Taiwan, the colonial government, has a lot of agency and impact before and during the war. I'm in dialogue and have been inspired by, of course, historians of other empires, especially the French and British, such as Thomas Metcalfe, who got a both of this institution, the role of India, Indian institutions in British expansion into Africa and Southeast Asia. And in my intro and on Q&A, I'd be happy to talk about the parallels, but also differences between India as Imperial Gateway, Taiwan as Imperial Gateway, especially Korea as Imperial Gateway, or what the Japanese called Hokmon or Northern Gateway into Manchuria. And again, I didn't want to be like a first generation scholar of empire that just looked at Japanese sources and Japanese perspectives. I'm really fascinated by Taiwanese, not just as the colonized, but as imperial intermediaries. And we have really great studies on Koreans as imperial intermediaries as well. And again, there are differences and similarities. This is the table of contents of the book. It's open access, so if you're interested in other parts of the book, please download it. I'm very blessed and privileged that I was able to do my field work in non-COVID times, my field work in China in sort of a pre-2018 period, where I was able to look at local, regional, national archives, and just not having a baby. So I'm less mobile now. So I won't get into all of the kinds of sources, but you can see the range. And again, very grateful for how well preserved Taiwan's colonial archives are. The British and the American foreign records are equally important to look at British, American, Japanese rivalries in South China. And they are talking about the roles of Taiwanese in these records. And then again, especially in revising my dissertation to the book, I incorporated as many transcribed oral histories so you can get biographical details of what it was like on the ground. So the first half of the book, looking at the informal empire, South China, although on this map that a lot of people use for teaching, is, there are these informal spheres of influence throughout China. People might call it semi-colonial spheres. And if Taiwan is imperial gateway into South China, the French have equal ambitions moving in from Indochina into Guangxi and then Yunnan, as well as Hainan. And as the US also were very excited about the Philippines as a potential gateway into South China, et cetera. So there are these parallels. I would argue Taiwan is one of the more successful ones in terms of its economic and then personnel inroads. And there are several reasons for that. One is at a time where the British and Americans are cracking down on Anglo-Chinese or ethnic Chinese of American nationalities, tracking down on their abilities to enjoy extraterritoriality. For example, the British, if you had a Hong Kong or Strait settlement subject moved to China by the late 19th century, the British refused to grant them equal British extraterritorial privileges, and same with the US. But the Japanese are welcoming, actively recruiting Chinese in Fujian and Guangdong to naturalize as overseas Taiwanese subjects and granted them equal extraterritorial privileges, meaning they didn't have to, they had Japanese consular protection, legal protection, didn't have to pay Chinese customs or taxes, et cetera. And so, this is an analytical category of overseas Taiwanese because many of these people call themselves Fujianese or Xiamen people, et cetera. But you have tens of thousands of overseas Taiwanese subjects in an overseas Taiwanese association in the South China Treaty Port cities by the 1910s and 1920s. So while we have a really, with the late Philip Kuhn as one of the pioneers of modern Chinese plus overseas Chinese diasporic studies and the important connections between China and Southeast Asia, very little of that makes its way into Japanese historiography. But in Taiwan, the Japanese are valuing the overseas Taiwanese, the Taiwanese precisely for their Chineseness. And this will, I think, challenge people's ideas of complete assimilation and trying to Japanize all Taiwanese subjects. They were viewed as perfect intermediaries precisely for their Hokkien, Minaiyu sort of Chinese language skills, their linguistic family economic networks. And obviously there's a hegemonic overseas Chinese population in Southeast Asia that they are trying to challenge. And the reason why Southeast Asia made its way into two chapters is because they're trying to mobilize the Taiwanese in Southeast Asia like they have successfully in South China. Chapter 3 looks at those limits, especially pre-1941, And it does, it probably is not a surprise because in French Indochina, the US Philippines, and most of Southeast Asia, which is under Western colonial rule, Japanese don't have extraterritorial privileges. The exceptions are Siam, which is independent, and Japan has a treaty with them in 1897, unequal treaty, which gives Japanese extraterritorial privileges. And also in the Dutch East Indies after 1899, the Japanese have honorary European legal and economic rights. So local Chinese and want to naturalize as Taiwanese in the Dutch East Indies, and also overseas Taiwanese can benefit from being in the East Indies compared to if they were an overseas Chinese or local Indonesian. Guo Chunyang, who's in the middle there, he is the Taiwanese tea and sugar magnate. He's got multiple nationalities, Dutch, British, and Japanese. The Japanese naturalized him in 1901, and he uses his Hokkien networks in Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the Dutch East Indies to his benefit. And the Japanese, like Sumi Bayashi on the right, they actually follow him from Taiwan and are working on for Guo Chunyang. So this is an interesting case where it's not the Japanese taking the lead, but Japanese working for someone like Guo Chunyang. But there are limits, and really up until the Pacific War, there are at most 1,000 Taiwanese throughout Southeast Asia, and with extensive overseas Chinese anti-Japanese boycotts from 1908, 1915, 21 demands, 1928, 1931, etc. Most Taiwanese are actually trying to not draw attention themselves, and they want to pass as overseas Chinese. So this is a very different case from South China. So it's a comparative, but also the Japanese really look at Nanxi Nanyo or Nanzhi Nanyang as a extended region, right? What they eventually call Nampo or Namfang, or the southern regions. The sort of ethnic Han connection makes it sort of natural, or in their propaganda ways, inevitable that they can expand from Taiwan, South China, Southeast Asia. Part two, the second half of the book, looking at the China War and then occupation of Southeast Asia, it's a different kind of overseas Taiwanese that's playing a mediator role. Again, trying to challenge the Kominka sort of historiography. The Chineseness and bilingual nature of Taiwanese subjects, there's a double-edged sword. They're extremely useful in China and overseas, in Southeast Asia, but the army especially doesn't trust them, and they, with Takufuji Chinese work, they choose to enlist and arm Koreans 4 years earlier, starting from 1938. Whereas in Taiwan, it's really not until 1942 that Taiwanese are allowed to be armed soldiers. So you have this difference already between Korea and Taiwan, even though the percentage of fluent Japanese speakers or bilingual, most likely patriotic Japanese is higher in Taiwan. The Koreans are the first to enlist. At the same time, from 1937, the Japanese are enlisting civilians as military assistants or auxiliaries, gunsoku, or gunbu in Japanese. And there is this volunteer fever. Now, of course, we understand volunteer from the Japanese perspective is potentially coerced or pressured, but they're, looking at memoirs and testimonies, there were many Taiwanese who wanted to volunteer for the 2 to 3 times a higher pay. And they thought, well, if we're going to eventually be enlisted, I'd rather be a civilian interpreter, potentially in a less dangerous area. And others who went to Japanese schools from the 20s and 30s were generally patriotic. They wanted to prove themselves as equally capable as their Japanese counterparts. So as you see with the book cover, the Taiwanese are the ones interfacing between Japanese and local Chinese, especially in places like Xiamen, Fuzhou, Hainan. And you can't generalize people's experiences, just even with the few oral histories that we have, there's a range. But we can talk about some of the inter-ethnic or inter-status tensions. So Hu Xiande, one of his oral testimonies, talks about low-ranking Japanese soldiers resenting him because as a Taiwanese educated interpreter, he had a higher salary than them. But at the same time, Japanese soldiers thought, look, you're a chankoro or a Chinaman chink. These derogatory terms of can't really be trusted because they might still view China as their ancestral homeland. At the same time, they're not loved by the Chinese POWs and local Chinese civilians that they're overseeing, the forced labor, the medicines, etc. And you can anticipate that by 1945, when Japan's empire falls, who are the Chinese going to remember? They're going to remember those Taiwanese that they've been interacting with for several years. Women do not play a huge role in the book, unfortunately, but they appear in chapter 5 and 6. One is the sort of female counterparts of Taiwanese nurse assistants. So there is sort of an equal volunteer fever, both for patriotic and pragmatic reasons why Taiwanese women would want to serve as nurse assistants in the war front, as you see here in Hainan Island. First of all, this idea of the Japanese nurse, which, that model patriotic, female hero has been there since the Sino-Russo-Japanese Wars. And so many who wanted to contribute, even though they understood they were going to be assistants second rank, they wanted to serve and then go overseas, and then also for potential pay. From memoirs and testimonies, they wore the same white uniforms, nurse uniforms, but they wore a different hat that signaled that they were not Japanese, but they were second-ranking Taiwanese. Yet they were in charge and overseeing local Chinese personnel. So again, they're in the second-ranking intermediary, place like their male counterparts. Of course, a darker history, which is less covered than their Korean counterparts, Taiwanese comfort women. Most of them have actually passed away, but there have been some excellent documentaries created in Taiwan. And then Zhu Delan of Taiwan is the pioneer who's interviewed about 15 to 20 former Taiwanese comfort women, both Han and indigenous Taiwanese. And of course, they are in a much different situation than nurses or military servicemen. From their testimonies, for the most part, they are tricked into thinking they're enlisting to become a nurse or to work overseas for higher pay, and oftentimes then are sent to comfort stations. And obviously, it's extremely traumatic and dark history. That said, one parallel with the imperial hierarchies that we see with their male counterparts is in Japanese documents, as well as Taiwanese oral testimonies. Japanese comfort women were paid the highest, supposed to be paid the highest wages. Koreans and Taiwanese second highest, then Chinese, then local Southeast Asians. So, of course, many were not ever paid their wages, and we know about compensation lawsuits and controversies. But the fact that the Japanese are identifying and ranking them as below the Japanese and above everyone else shows that Taiwanese status cross genders still mattered. I will say, like with the Korean perspective, with the Korean perspective, it's not a Japanese male versus Taiwanese female issue with comfort women. You had Taiwanese male comfort station managers who were equally complicit in making money off this, as well as testimony from Taiwanese military servicemen who made use of comfort stations. So we have to sort of keep that in mind in terms of Taiwanese complicity in the system. When we turn to 1941 in Southeast Asia, you have some parallels with South China. Han interpreters, especially in Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, where you have a high percentage of Hokkien-speaking, Minnan-speaking populations. They are the frontline interpreters. But then you also have businessmen, agricultural managers, who are again in supervisory positions. Sarah Kovner spoke on POWs. There are a few Korean, as she talks about the Korean POW prison guards. Well, with close to 200,000 allied POWs, the Japanese are frantically getting as many just warm bodies down there to oversee allied POWs. And so you have several thousand Taiwanese sent to the Dutch East Indies and elsewhere to oversee allied POWs, and many of them will pay for it. Indigenous Taiwanese come into the story really in chapter 6. The Taiwan Army, Taiwan government in general, they say, look, let's make use of indigenous Taiwanese used to jungle warfare, mountainous terrain, to go to places like New Guinea and the Philippines. Also, the anthropological colonial knowledge also comes into play. This idea that Austronesian speaking indigenous Taiwanese could potentially learn the local languages and serve as linguistic intermediaries. There's testimony from Japanese officers as well as indigenous Taiwanese, how many of them were able to pick up the local dialect languages in the Philippines, for example, and mediate between local tribal chiefs and the Japanese. So this is an example from the Singapore National Archive. Lim Boom King, a prominent position and leading overseas Chinese leader in Singapore, is in the middle. You have Japanese army officers left and behind, and then you have a Taiwanese interpreter, Tui, on the right, who basically with them will start to fundraise, and of course that's a Japanese term, but put pressure on the overseas Chinese community to donate and to collaborate with the Japanese. The thousands of Chinese POWs, you have memoirs and testimony from the four of here, as you see, who because of torturing, executing, etc., Allied POWs are tried as BC war criminals and sentenced to, a long prison sentences in the post-45 period. So again, this is different from South China. And then you have indigenous volunteers. Again, a photo like this that you can find in the Asahi and Mainichi photo archives. Clearly, if it's approved by the Japanese censors, is there to promote this idea of the uncivilized, raw savages as now 1940s patriotic indigenous model warriors using their indigenous swords to help cut down trees, pave roads, and then identify what to eat, etc. But both in media, Japanese media, but also in testimonies, they really are sort of heroized. So to try to wrap it up, in conclusion, to look beyond Japan and Taiwan, imperial hierarchies within the empire are one thing, with generally speaking, Japanese, Han, and indigenous. But those same Han and indigenous second, third ranking Taiwanese subjects, when they go overseas, whether it's in the pre-war, but especially in the wartime period, they have much to gain. And it's a very complicated issue of war responsibility and agency, et cetera, that I try to address in the epilogue. But they are, of course, many will defend themselves and say, well, if they didn't act the way they did or serve the way they did, they would have been tortured or executed by their Japanese overseers, but they are in positions of power over the local Chinese, Southeast Asian, Western powers, which again makes it an extremely complicated post-war aftermath for them. Those who mediate between the Japanese and Chinese and Westerners become the primary targets. In South China, Chiang Kai-shek initiated, there's a not only are there retaliatory attacks and killings, but this idea of should we try them as Hanjian, Han traders, or later they're seen as, well, no, we're going to try them as Japanese war criminals because of their nationality during the wartime period. And then much attention gets to is given to the Tokyo war crimes trials, but Yuma Totani's second book on the other war crimes trials throughout Southeast Asia, British, Australian, Dutch, French, etc., they will try Taiwanese as BC war criminals. And you can see that paper evidence in Australian, British, American archives. So this in-betweenness, not just during the pre-war wartime period, continues for many post-war, many times in the post-war period. In an epilogue, I mean, this, several books could be written on this, so I couldn't really do justice, but to try to talk about sort of what happens, the infamous legacies, and the alienation, of course, that the Taiwanese feel once they return to a post 228 Taiwan ruled by Chiang Kai-shek. The famous Chinese sort of saying, Taiwanese saying is that the Japanese dogs left and the Chinese pigs came in, and sort of this recolonization of Taiwan by the ROC. So I'll wrap it up there and look forward to everyone's questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Shirane. This was just an amazing talk regarding an incredibly rich book. And so I'd like to open up the floor now to discussion. And in the US-Japan program, one of the annual visitors is appointed in advance to ask the first question. And I understand today that is Takahiro Omori, Associate Staff Writer of the Sankei Shimbun. So.
Fascinating presentation. When I stayed in Japan, I discussed with some CEOs of Japanese companies. They said that Taiwan is kind of gateway for Chinese market. It meaning they completely understand Chinese culture, Chinese market system, or present Chinese region. Right? So, and also one of the reasons that Taiwan was treated as gateway was geography at the time. So based on these factors, I guess the role of Taiwan has not changed right now, so especially during Chinese expansion, the role of Taiwan Taiwan might increase. So this is my question: that what do you think about future role as gateway for both of China or Japan or other country?
Okay, yeah, thank you very much for the question. So certainly with some of these days Gaiga Kaifang open and reform, many of the Japanese businesses based in Taiwan pre-72, with the normalization of relations with the PRC, they're taking that knowledge and Chinese language or Chinese skills, and then going into the China market. And then even today too, of course, many businesses, both Taiwanese and Japanese, have relations that are triangular, right, between Japan, Taiwan, and China. So this idea of a gateway or Taiwan having this bilingual legacy and many Taiwanese still having Japanese skills or Japanese networks plays a huge business role. Of course, the Cold War context is vastly different, but with the ROC Japan-US alliance, there are many parallels where, for example, the US doesn't want Taiwan to become a Chinese imperial gateway or a Chinese gateway for further communist expansion. So that's a huge reason why the US and Japan are to this day defending Taiwan's sovereignty. That said, I will say a huge difference from pre-45 to post-45 until the 70s is that these fluid flows between South China and Taiwan that were very dynamic from the Ming Qing period up through the Japanese period really do get cut off. Of course, David Wong and many others who talk about the KMT evacuation, and they're cut off from family members for decades. So there is a closing of Taiwan as a gateway into China that is then reopened in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. This is sort of maybe a tangential answer to your question, but this idea of Southern advance or Nanjing in the pre-World War time period by the Japanese is sort of similarly adopted or echoed by the Japanese in terms of flooding the Southeast Asian markets. And there's, great work about how, Japanese bureaucrats and businessmen in Manchuria in the 30s and 40s, that, including Kichinobusuke, that are, reinvesting those ties, and there's an economic advance and not occupation, but advance or nanshin in the 50s and 60s. And then in Taiwan in the 90s, they talk about let's do a southern Nanjing, southern advance towards Nanyang or the Southeast Asia, precisely because they want to be less reliant on Chinese markets and to have closer ties. So southern advance, gateways, and especially Taiwan's geographical and demographic connections to South China and Southeast Asia play a huge role. So I can't give like a real succinct answer to that, but there's much to be discussed in future works.
You both. So other questions from the audience? I think we can also take questions from our Zoom participants too. Yes.
Thank you very much. I'm from Japan, and I'm currently a first year student at the school right now, and I'm very excited about this topic. And I want to ask you about the ultimate purpose of the Japanese Imperial, because I think there's two courses for imperialists that how to treat the people overseas. Like I think one is the integrated the nation to a single ethnic group. Like Zhonghua means it's not a Han Chinese right now. It's very integrated terms currently used. So that's one course, and another one is that it's much more differentiating and more admitting the autonomous state of those places. So what do you think that the Japanese imperialists have taught to treat Taiwan? Is it integral or more autonomous?
Excellent question, and this really deals with trying to put Japan in a comparative empire perspective. I think in Barry Cooper and Jane Fairbanks' sort of empires sort of textbook, they talk about the dual, as you say, almost all empires, there's this tension of integrating and assimilating while excluding and differentiating. And I think in Japan gets sort of from the Mark Petey days simplified as they were more assimilatory than their French and British counterparts, where they're teaching them Japanese, and trying to integrate them more than their Western counterparts. But I think that simplifies the story of the differentiation is happening simultaneously, especially with the Han Taiwanese case. My chapter 4 on 1937, Kominka, Liu Qing and others, it's this idea of, we know that they're banning the use of Chinese, spoken Chinese, and intensifying the doka into Kominka or assimilatory tendencies to like a full Japanization. But most of the population still doesn't understand Japanese, so they actually they create this new Chinese language radio channel so that they can propagate why they're going to China successfully, why they're going to Southeast Asia. So they're using the Chineseness, and they're also using and taking advantage of the Chineseness of their interpreters. And so while they want loyalty and Japanese patriotism among their subjects, they're valuing that different aspect. And that is different from the Korea. You don't have Koreans being enlisted to translate for their ethnic and linguistic ties to the Chinese that they are going into in terms of Manchuria or North China. But the Chineseness of the Taiwanese is what is seen as valued. So I think from the pre-war to the wartime period, the assimilatory and differentiating is happening simultaneously. And this is not defending Japanese imperialism, but they're strategic time to maximize both. And if we were saying that they were doing it better than their Western counterparts, again, that's not saying that this is a good thing, but I think it shows something unique. For example, Indians are enlisted as policemen in the treaty port cities, especially Shanghai, Guangzhou. The Japanese in the 40s are telling the British, you need to hire more Taiwanese policemen because these Indians can't communicate with the local Chinese. Our Taiwanese can communicate with the local Chinese. They're going to be way more useful. So the British Indians or French Vietnamese, they play a different role in China or neighboring regions compared to the Japanese. So again, the whole project is really looking at this tension and the how they're not exclusive, they're happening at the same time.
Before we go on to the next question, we have some questions coming in over Zoom as well. I just wonder if you could elaborate a bit on that, but in particular, the comparison with India, because you mentioned in your talk that you'd be glad to speak a little more to that comparison, and you alluded briefly to the situation of the Indian policemen in treaty port cities in China. You could just, again, elaborate a bit on that, help us put your findings in better.
So, this is, it's a challenge, and of course, I didn't do justice in just, a few pages in my intro. But as we know, India had Britain's largest army. And from a military perspective, Taiwan never had its independent army, and the number of soldiers stationed in Taiwan, not only a fraction of that to India, but even within Japan's empire, most of the army priorities were in Korea and Manchuria. Also, India had its own foreign office and was able to have direct diplomatic exchanges, whereas Taiwan had to defer to the Tokyo Foreign Ministry. So on the official level, qualitatively, quantitatively, India, there's a lot more power and resources. At this and also at the same time, when we're looking at Indian subjects versus Taiwanese subjects, you have millions of Indian laborers. And for the most part, it is not the Indian elite, although you have a Gandhi traveling, and other elites traveling, but they're in the minority. Instead, you have almost equivalent to in class to Chinese migrant laborers, Indian laborers and going to Southern Africa and Southeast Asia. The class dynamic for the Taiwanese, on the other hand, it's much more middle to upper class. They are not it's not poor Taiwanese farmers physically migrating to South China for more opportunity. It's them taking advantage of business opportunities in South China or local wealthy Chinese just naturalizing. So you have a huge class element. And that also differentiates it. The Korean India one is probably more parallel, where that Japanese displaced a lot of Korean farmers, and many Korean farmers are moving to Manchuria for more farmland and opportunities. And again, the difference with Korea and Taiwan is you have fewer Chinese trying to become overseas Koreans or sort of fake Koreans. In fact, you needed Chinese nationality to purchase land in Manchuria. So in many ways, even though there are many more Koreans and many more Indians, on average, the Taiwanese privilege and economic class is much higher in the South China case. Lastly, in the imperial hierarchy, Korea has more resources and it's a larger population, and there's more prestige with being a Korean governor general. You have future prime ministers or army ministers who come from the Korean government general, and it's a step down to be a Taiwan governor general. That said, Manchuria studies have showed us that there's a four-headed monster, meaning the Korea government general in the Manchuria-Korea borderlands. You have the South Manchurian Railway, the Guangdong Army, the Guangdong Governor General, and the Korean government general, all competing for more jurisdiction and more interest. Whereas, and the foreign ministry, like they are all Hoxi or northern expansion. Whereas in South China, the foreign ministry is not placing a lot of resources. So they defer and actually delegate a lot of the responsibilities to the Taiwan government general. So in the, relatively speaking, Taiwan government general has less power or less status, but in South China, because it's less crowded, they actually have more of a legal, economic, geostrategic role that they can play. So again, that's sort of paralleling and then differentiating it between the India, Korea. So.
That's great. That's wonderfully comprehensive response. So thank you so much for that. And we have, as mentioned, a number of questions coming in over Zoom. So I'll just take the first one here. This question is from Nobuhisa Ishizuka, and he says, I'm very interested in the inter-bureaucratic rivalries between the colonies, which Professor Shirane says have their own imperial interests and ambitions. Could Professor Shirane please elaborate on the local rivalries and ambitions of the Taiwanese and other colonial authorities vis-a-vis Japanese hold authority? We have many other questions too, so you can keep your answer brief.
Okay, maybe field one more.
Sure, okay. So we have another one. Let's see. This is from Aishin Yi, who says, thank you for sending wonderful paper. I did a microhistory project on a Taiwanese nurse trained in the Taiwan branch of Japanese Red Cross Medical Center in the 1930s, who later joined a Japanese medical team to Hainan Island in the 1940s, also using local history materials. Very excited to see the connection between their work and your work. And so the question is, could you say more about what the Taiwanese nurses' work looked like? So who did they treat? What kind of patients did they treat? What were their working conditions compared with the working conditions of Japanese colleagues and so forth?
Okay, two excellent questions and really difficult questions. I'll try to say a little bit about the rivalries between Taiwan and the Taiwan government general and the other sort of I would say less of a gateway, but southern base, which is Micronesia, right? Occupied by the Japanese during World War I, taken from Germany, and is a mandate, a League of Nations mandate. So what's interesting, and I didn't get to talk about in the book, the talk, is that once Japan has occupied the South China treaty ports, Hainan, as well as some of the South China Sea islands, such as the Spratlys, the Taiwan government general proposes to Tokyo and the colonial ministry, which is overseeing all of its colonies, if Taiwan could become the head of the southern region's government general, and as simultaneously the head of the southern region's government general, oversee occupied South China, the South China Sea islands, Taiwan, and Micronesia. Meaning, instead of having these different visions of southern expansion, try to integrate the economic and administrative responsibilities and have it unified under Taiwan. And ultimately, the colonial ministry and Navy and Army rejected. They don't want the government general to have too much power, especially over Micronesia, which becomes a huge important military base, obviously in the 30s and 40s for the Pacific War. But not concession, but they actually place the Spratlys in the South China Seas as administering part of Kaohsiung or Takao. So you have this island very far away from Taiwan that is now administratively part of Taiwan. And although the Army and Navy did not allow Taiwan government general to directly administer Xiamen, Fuzhou, the occupied South China territories, they drew on the 4 decades of experience and they enlisted high-ranking Taiwan government general officials to post in Xiamen, Fuzhou, and then brought in Taiwanese policemen, teachers, lawyers, etc. So if there's sort of a takeaway in the rivalry and cooperation between the Tokyo ministries and Taiwan government general, Taiwan is wanting more, and from an administrative perspective, many of the Tokyo ministries are pushing back and not giving Taiwan free rein like in the India case. but they are enlisting and drawing and relying on that expertise. For the Taiwanese nurse question, that's fantastic and sounds like, you know, has even way more materials than the ones that I drew on, which were transcribed oral histories. You know, I did not get to have, you know, I drew on a couple memoirs and then a couple oral testimonies, and a lot of it was treating local Japanese workers, for example, who had been farmers who had been sent to Hainan or other military personnel. But in terms of the day-to-day, what their work was like, you know, I didn't get to investigate that as much. So, you know, I really look forward to this person's work coming out as well.
Yeah, I think we can share the chat with you. So we have a question from Professor Ian Miller, and I will combine that with a question from Professor Tim George, which is on Zoom. So Ian, why don't you ask your question?
Oh, I never follow Tim. We'll let Tim go first.
Okay, so we will have Tim go first, then I'll have your, and we'll
Yeah.
post them together because
Yeah.
we are unfortunately
Running out of
running
time.
a little short on time. Okay. So Tim George's question reads as follows. In the book, In Search of Our Frontier, Japanese America and Settler Colonialism in the Construction of Japan's Borderless Empire, Ichiro Azuma describes the back and forth movements of Japanese between North America, Hawaii, Korea, Taiwan, Hainan, and elsewhere, and how their language, business, and technical skills, such as for the pineapple industry, benefited Japan's empire building. So, what did you see of Han Taiwanese moving back and forth rather than just emigrating from Taiwan and then staying put between Taiwan, the mainland, Hainan, and Southeast Asia, and the ways this provided opportunities for Japan? You get that?
Yes.
Okay. And Ian.
Yeah, which actually relates. So Seiji, I really look forward to teaching the book. It's exciting work, and thank you. I think you began to address some of the questions that I wanted to ask about, and then Tim has also highlighted an element of it. Really, my question is about archives and the ways that you have addressed the challenges of writing imperial history. And especially I'm interested in hearing you talk about the edges of the formal archive. Bureaucrats love to tell the story of the state. It's very legible and valuable and frankly important. So the answer may be, you know, this is where a formal power resided. That is the history I'm given. And that is a strong answer. Nonetheless, I wanted to ask you specifically, as you think your way into, or bring us into your thinking about archives, to think with us about indigenous archives, Atayal and other groups along that so-called savage border, and the 4,500 indigenous volunteers that you discussed. And second, and this is where Tim, as usual, was ahead of me, you know, business, the works of capitalists and capitalism as exchange and movement, and you know, a more layered approach to the engagements that we usually think about through the lens of the state and the military. I'd really love to hear you think with us about business, you know, engagements, the work of empire, and then specifically, again, I'm interested in archives. So how have you thought about materials and accessing them?
So yeah, no, thank you for both of these rich questions. I certainly cite Professor Azuma and, you know, his work, that it is very not only trans-regional but trans-Pacific, and the Hawaii, California, Taiwan connections are you know, really fascinating. It's interesting that, you know, and again, one of his interventions, but then also provocative interventions, is to call Japanese Americans or Japanese as settler colonialists, especially from the Japanese American studies perspective. I don't use the word settler colonialism for the Han Taiwanese, and I think that's what differentiates his Japanese and Japanese American or migrants from the Han Taiwanese. Precisely because I'm not sure if I use it, I would almost call them proxy colonials or proxy settlers, or in that proxy migrants, in that they are not, the majority of them in South China are not settling from one area. It's not physical migration. Rather, they're using the dual nationality and colonial subjecthood for their own gains. And that also differentiates the demographic in that Azuma's book looks at the role of agriculture, skills, and labor that's being transferred and moved around the island. Again, the majority of Han Taiwanese are not working in agriculture. They're more urban-based and commercial-based, which goes to Ian's question of, well, then what are the business and capitalist kind of connections, and what's the process for Han Taiwanese? I'll give an example from chapter 2, where many local Chinese in Xiamen, they want the extraterritorial privileges so that they can expand their opium businesses and opium enterprises at a time where there's these opium bans or anti-opium movements. So this creates this headache for the Japanese, where there are rival Chinese officials who want access to the opium, or rival, who want to crack down on their Chinese rivals who are using Taiwanese subjecthood and Japanese protection, but they're immune from that. So, but the Japanese foreign ministry consuls are saying this is causing, it's not helping our Sino-Japanese relations, it's causing more tension, a lot of money, a lot of our time and resources. These are not even real Japanese subjects that they were protecting. So this is an example of the unexpected consequences of the gateway. The gateway is not just helping out Japanese interests. They wanted to recruit and draw on these wealthy Taiwanese, but the Taiwanese, yes, they're giving a lot of donations and funds to Japanese causes, but they're also creating headaches with their opium enterprises, which, unlike Manchuria, where Miriam Kingsburg and others have talked about Korean opium merchants benefiting, but also helping and funding the Guangdong Army. The Japanese colonial and consular officials are not tapping in or benefiting from the economic interests of these opium enterprises. So it's where the Han Taiwanese businesses and businessmen are doing it for their individual interests. It's not under a pro-China or anti-China or pro-Japan or anti-Japan framework, and it causes a lot of again, headaches for the Japanese colonial officials. So that's one aspect that I think chapter 2 addresses. Oh, the archives. I think along with myself, I really do think this generation of scholars working in Japanese, Chinese, Korean, Mongolian, we are hopefully value added by going beyond the Japanese official archive. And what I try to do is try to bring local Chinese official and then media sources. What are the Xiamen Chinese authorities and what are their reactions to this naturalization and influx of Taiwanese? And then what are the British and Americans also saying about these actors? One hard part of the pre-war period is you don't have written records by these overseas Taiwanese themselves. But the British and Americans, I'm not saying that they have a neutral view, but they have a non-Japanese perspective on the role of the Taiwanese. So I added the British and American perspective to say that the British and Americans are threatened and are seeing the rivalry natures, but also their take on the Taiwanese situation. And then lastly, the oral histories for the wartime period by Han and indigenous Taiwanese, especially as you said, the close to 5,000 indigenous Taiwanese volunteers. And the challenge with using these oral histories is there's of course a retrospective lens and a political lens. The political lens is they haven't been able to tell their story because they've been excluded from the ROC, Chinese mainlander society. So all this anti-KMT, anti-Chinese sentiment is brought out, and then Taiwanese, historians are asking them leading questions about how Japanese colonial empire has contributed to their Taiwanese identity. So in my book, I don't use the word identity. I don't use Taiwanese as a de facto national a term. I really took the note to the reader in the term seriously as the legal political term. But that said, if we were generalize the indigenous Taiwanese sort of idealization of Japanese rule and feeling Japanese is much more than their Han Taiwanese counterparts, because they never felt this pull between their Chinese motherland and Japanese fatherland. And in the Han Taiwanese case, many were excited initially, but then there's a disappointment. Whereas with the indigenous Taiwanese, there was never hope or disappointment, just extreme. And many of them refused to learn Mandarin. Whereas, of course, if you're a Han Taiwanese, to survive, you had to learn Mandarin post 45. So in the epilogue, I tried to talk about some of the differences between the Han and Taiwanese and the use of sources. But the methodological question of I like how you phrased it, the sort of archives on the edges is a really tricky one, and I look forward to how other scholars approach it.
Thank you so much. Very quickly, or because we're over
Very
time.
quickly. By my son's marriage, I'm related to 3 generations of Taiwanese doctors. The first of that generation, going back to like the 40s, was educated in Japan. I was thinking that kind of like the English built an education system in India, the Japanese seem to have done quite a good bit for at least the native Taiwanese and their education. Comment briefly.
So if you want to go to the Tokyo Contact Nebula, you should look at Karen Thornber's book, really on how the educated Taiwanese medical literary community, it's all in Tokyo in the metropole. And I cite that, but don't include that episode because you actually did not need a visa and you could freely travel from Taiwan to Tokyo. It's just a matter of cost, right? You need to be middle upper class to send your child to, and the elites did send their children to get an university education in Tokyo. Interestingly, you didn't need a visa and apply for a passport to go to China. Many were rejected and so then had to sort of go to Nagasaki and then go to China in that sense. But those who were anti-colonial or pro-China went to Shanghai universities and other universities, and many of them ended up becoming pro-KMT or working with the KMT. So the Tokyo story in Japanese language, you want to look at Wakabayashi Masahiro, who recently retired, on the intellectual, anti-colonial movement that really starts in Tokyo and then is re-imported into Taiwan. And then exciting work like Satoru and as well as, of course, Karen Thornber, is Tokyo with Taiwanese meeting up with their Korean, Chinese, and other counterparts as well as leftist Japanese. So that is another book, but the Tokyo story is there, and I refer to it, but more in terms of comparing it to what's going on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Shirane. This has been wonderful. Thank you.